Hi, like and subscribe for the more true, scary stories. Story 1.
The night was quiet until we got the call that 3 men were beating a homeless person to death. Dispatch called 2 patrol units along with EMS, and when the first deputy got there, they phoned me as the investigator on call. I went to the scene, pulling up just as the ambulance was driving away. The 3 assailants were in the back of the 2 patrol cars, and when I checked with Deputy Marin, he told me they'd still been attacking the poor guy when he pulled up. Not even the lights and sirens slowed them down. It wasn't until the first one was hit with a stun gun that the other 2 glanced around and then stepped away from the man lying on the ground between them. Marin looked at me warily, his eyes watering slightly as he shook his head. They weren't just beating him, Jess. They were cutting on him too. Damnedest thing I've ever... He swallowed and wiped his mouth as he glanced over to the patch of blood on the asphalt nearby. Just don't be surprised if this turns into a murder case, yeah? I nodded, frowning. What did EMS say when they got here? Was he still alive? Marin rubbed his eyes. Yeah, he's alive. Stable even, but just barely. I could tell they were rushing to slow the bleeding until they could get him to the hospital. Just hope he can hang on long enough to make it. He looked back up toward the patrol cars. What do you want to do with these 3 pieces of shit? Shrugging, I glanced around. Place them under arrest and read them Miranda. Then get someone to bring them all to the station so I can do interviews. Make sure you and Dave check for anyone that might have seen something. I gestured across the street at the squat houses that sat slowly moldering there. Canvass the neighborhood and check for any cameras in the area. He nodded and was about to head off when I stopped him. Did any of them say anything? Any idea why they did it? Marin gave a bitter laugh. One of them said something to Dave, told him they didn't have a choice. He shook his head. Mean, crazy bastard said they had to do it. Informal interview summary 1. James Buckner. I began my interview with the subject in interview room 2, age 18. He was the youngest of the 3 suspects. Buckner had not only graduated high school as valedictorian, but had started college a year early. In the fall, he would be a sophomore at the state university. He appeared clean and well-groomed, other than the dirt and blood that seemed attributable to the attack on the other man that evening. When I entered the room, he looked up nervously, and his obvious anxiety didn't lessen as I sat down and started pulling out paperwork. Still, he listened as I went through Miranda again, and when I asked him if he understood his rights and would waive them to talk to me, he agreed without hesitation. I asked the initial questions you always ask: name, address, occupation, that kind of thing. And then I started into the meat of it with a very general question. So tell me what happened tonight. His hands were trembling as he looked across the table at me with wet eyes. Is that guy going to die? Keeping my expression neutral, I shrugged. It's too early to say, I think. I'm sure they're doing everything they can to help him, though. When we get done, I'll check with the hospital to see how he's doing. I leaned forward slightly. For now, though, I need you to tell me what happened tonight. Everything. Be honest, and don't leave anything out. That's the best way to help yourself at this point. A tear rolled down his cheek as he nodded slightly. Yeah, I'll tell you what I know, but I don't know much. I'd come home for the weekend from school to see my girlfriend. She lives not far from where that happened, but I wanted to surprise her, so I parked a block away and was going to walk over and go up to the back door. He shuddered as he went on. But I don't think I ever made it. I was walking through this empty lot. I've used it as a cut-through to her house before. And someone spoke to me. I think maybe it was that guy, but I don't know for sure. What did he say to you? Did he say something that made you mad? Buckner's eyes widened. No, nothing like that. I think he asked me if I'd help him. Help him how? He began crying more freely now. I don't know. The next thing I remember, we were beating him, cutting on him. I could see myself doing it, but I couldn't make myself stop. It was like I was dreaming and couldn't wake up. Lowering his head into his hands, he went on. Then the cop came up. He told us to stop, but we didn't. I couldn't, like I said. Then he shocked me, and everything went fuzzy for a second. Next thing I remember, I was in handcuffs being put in the back of the cop's car. Had you ever met the man you were attacking before? He shook his head from between his palms. No, not that I know of, and I don't know why I did it. Why any of us did it. Did you know either of the other two men with you? No, I recognize Mr. Lankin from the grocery store, though that's mainly from the picture they have up front of him. The other guy I don't know at all. When did you first see them? He let out a half sob. When we were hurting that guy. I looked up and saw them hurting that man the same as I was. Hurting him, but looking at each other and at me, looking like I felt. And how's that? How did they look? How did you feel? When he looked up again, his eyes were red-rimmed and raw. Like we were trapped in a nightmare we couldn't stop. Informal interview summary 2. Gary Lankin. Gary Lankin is a 55-year-old man who has lived in town for the past 20 years. For the last 14, he's been the manager of one of the large supermarkets in town. A check of his criminal history shows no arrests, and his driver's record is clear other than a speeding ticket 2 years ago. I know of him from around town, and as far as I know, he has a reputation for being a jolly, honest guy whose biggest vice is that he talks too much if he runs into you. Sitting in the harsh, fluorescent light of interview room 3, he didn't look jolly. Covered in another man's blood and his own sweat, he looked more like a caged animal when he glanced up at me and said nothing as I entered. Going over to the table, I sat down and watched him quietly for a moment before starting into his rights. When I got to the point of asking if he was willing to talk to me, he just stared. Look, if you don't want to talk to me, that's fine. But this is your chance to tell your side of what happened. If you don't answer, I'll take that as a no and leave you alone. Grimacing, he rubbed a thick hand across his cheek and snorted. What difference does it make I'm fucked, aren't I? I don't know that, but again, if you want to talk, you have to make clear to me that you understand your rights and are Yeah, I understand them. I'll sign the waiver or whatever. His eyes narrowed. But don't think you can fucking trick me. I'm doing this because I'm innocent. I slid the waiver over to him and watched him sign it. No one is trying to trick you, but we don't understand what happened tonight or why. So tell me what you remember, okay? He glowered at me silently for several seconds. I'd rather talk to Bill Murphy about this. No offense, little lady, but I don't know you well. My smile felt thin and brittle. Well, I'm the lead investigator on this case, and you don't get to pick who interviews you. So you want to talk, or are you wasting my time? Lankin let out a sigh and shrugged. No, that's fine. You need to understand that I didn't do this. Or maybe I did, but I wasn't in control. Someone must have drugged me or something. Me and the other guys too, I guess. I've known Terry for years, and he's not a bad guy. The young kid I've seen in the store, but I don't really know. His mouth was slack as his eyes drifted away. But who would do this kind of thing, especially in our town? He brought his gaze back to mine. I know I wouldn't. Not unless someone had drugged me or something. I nodded. We're going to be getting blood from you all as soon as we're done talking. You can consent to the draw, or I can get a search warrant. Maybe there is something in your system, or there was, but you feel clear enough to talk to me now. Yeah, I do. Good. Then tell me what you remember. I was in the store, finishing close down for the night. We lock the doors at 9, do the final register checks, and then the place is empty until the stalkers come in at 5 the next morning. I was the last one left, and I was walking to the back to leave myself when I saw someone down one of the aisles. It was aisle 4. Soup and other canned goods. Who was it? I didn't know at the time. I didn't recognize him. He had on a sweatshirt with the hood up and... Look, the last few years, we get homeless people coming in sometimes, right? Usually it's fine. But once or twice before, they've tried to stay in past closing. I figured that's what this was. I called out to him, telling him the store was closed and I needed to walk him out. He trailed off as he began to tremble. What happened next? Lankin lowered his eyes to his hands as he went on. I think he turned toward me. I don't know. The next thing I remember, I was hitting and cutting him in the street, like those other guys. He started to reach forward and then stopped himself at my hard stare. I felt my phone buzz in my jacket. I swear, we were looking at each other while we were attacking him. None of us wanted to do it. It was like we had to, crazy as that sounds. Pulling out my phone, I saw I had a text message with 3 pictures from Marin. Marin, the victim, is stable at the hospital. These are some initial pics the deputy there took before they bandaged up his wounds. The pictures were of different parts of the man's body: a leg, his chest, and an arm. All 3 were swollen and starting to bruise, but I barely noticed. All I could see were the symbols that had been carved into his flesh. Red, precise slashes across his mottled skin, crisscrossing in a way that looked purposeful and meaningful, though I had no idea what the purpose or meaning might be. So I held up my phone to Lankin. Did you do this? His eyes widened as I flipped between the 3 photos. I don't know. I don't see how, but I know I cut him. We all did. Snorting, I shook my head as I stuck my phone closer to his face. Those don't look like random cuts to me, or by someone that wasn't looking at what they were doing. What do these symbols mean? Leaning back in his chair, his lower lip began to quiver. I don't know. I swear I don't. Maybe the other ones did that, but if that's for me, it was an accident. Turning my phone back to me when it buzzed again, I reread the new message from Marin twice. Marin done at scene. Heading to hospital now. The roadie there is now saying the victim is disfigured, like not from the attack, but his head isn't normal or something. Think the kid is confused. I saw the guy at the scene. He was dirty and fucked up, but his head was the least hurt part of him, and it didn't look weird. I looked back up at Lankin. Did you know this guy you attacked? The man shook his head, his expression miserable. So your story is that you see this stranger in your store, you tell him he needs to go, then next thing you know, you and these 2 other guys are out on the street, 5 miles from the store, kicking the shit out of this guy, while you cut these clearly intricate symbols into him, all the while not even really looking at what you're doing. Yeah, I mean, because you're all looking at each other, right? Not even paying attention to what you're doing. These people that you didn't plan this with. You're all just magically attacking this guy and carving the same kinds of things all over him. Is that what you're saying? It sounds crazy, but No, it sounds like bullshit. I puffed out a breath. Mr. Lankin, are you and these other gentlemen in some kind of cult or something? His face flushed. Are you crazy? Of course not. Leaning forward, I glared at him. Well, that makes more sense than what you're saying. So do you want to try again, or you sticking with this? Sniffing, he wrapped his arms around his stomach. I think I want a lawyer now. Informal interview. Summary 3. Terrence Wells. As I opened the door to interview room 1, someone started to scream. It was a high, sharp sound that made me wince and cover my ears, even as I tried to see into the room through watering slits. Wells wasn't at the table, but was instead sitting against the wall with his back to me. The screaming had to be coming from him, though I didn't know how he could make a sound like that. I tried to yell over the noise as I stepped closer to tell him I was there to help. That's when his hand appeared, red and slick with blood, as he flung something against the far wall. I followed the trajectory of it and saw the small mound of meat on the floor, where it had slid down the cinder block like a gory slug. It was Terry's tongue. Marin, I'm bringing Terry Wells to the ER. Crazy bastard just ripped out his own tongue. We got his mouth packed with gauze, but I didn't want to wait for an ambulance. You already there? There was a crackle over the radio, and then I heard Marin's voice through the static. Yeah, I'm here. Jess, I don't know if you should bring him here. Maybe carry him over to the uni hospital instead. What, that's twice as far? Why, they've lost the guy, the victim. My hand tightened on the steering wheel. What do you mean, lost him? He died. Crackle then. No, I mean he's gone. No one knows where, and that's not all. What do you mean? I talked to one of the ER docs before we knew he was missing. The roadie was right. even though it don't make sense. They said the guy was severely disfigured, something they haven't ever seen before. Disfigured how? Deprosopus or something. Said it's like when a twin doesn't get absorbed all the way. I don't know. But, Jess, this fucker, they say he's got 3 mouths. Marin was waiting with 2 nurses when I pulled up to the ER, and 5 minutes later, Wells was in the back being treated while Marin told me there was still no sign of the victim, though there were 2 more deputies coming to help search the area. Shaking my head, I tried to think of anything else we could do, short of calling the state police for help. What about the road deputy Rob, wasn't it? Sure he didn't see anything? He was supposed to be watching him? Shaking his head slowly, Marin didn't meet my eyes when he spoke. He's a dumb kid. He says he didn't see or hear anything. And when he found out the guy had ghosted, he looked like he was going to throw up. I told him to chill out and go look around in the parking lot for him. More so, he didn't yak in here or get in the way. I raised an eyebrow. How long has he been out there? I didn't see him when I pulled up. Marin paled slightly. Shit, it's probably been 20 minutes. He hit his mic. 7:15, what's your 20? When he didn't hear anything back, he tried again before calling dispatch. They hadn't heard from the roadie either and couldn't raise him on the radio. He shook his head. What the fuck is going on around? He broke off as one of the ER doctors came into the waiting area. I'm sorry, but your prisoner didn't make it. I stared at him with disbelief. What do you mean he was bleeding a decent bit? But we'd slowed that before I brought him. The woman shrugged. I'm sure you did your best. And it wasn't the blood loss that killed him anyway. We think he had a massive heart attack, though we'll have to wait for the post-mortem to be sure. I went to say more when mine and Marin's phones started buzzing at the same time. Meeting each other's eyes, we answered the calls. It was the office. Buckner and Lankin were both found dead in their adjacent holding cells. Lankin's right arm was bloody, but it was easy to understand why. He'd had to shove his fat forearm between the bars far enough to get leverage, and the effort cost him most of the skin there. Buckner was thinner, so it was easier for him. In the end, though, it came to the same thing for both of them, because somehow, within the span of less than the hour since I'd left them, they'd ripped out each other's tongues. My hands were tight and shaky on the wheel as I drove the empty, moonlit path back to the office. It was past 2 a.m. now, but I wasn't sleepy or even tired. There was too much to do. I needed to call the sheriff, Vegas conference or not, and I needed to get someone from the state police down here, and we still needed to locate the victim and find out. I slammed on the brakes as a figure appeared on the road before me. It was him, the victim. He was still wearing a hospital gown and had bandages taped all over his body, but it was his head, framed in the yellow glow of my headlights, that I couldn't look away from. Marin was wrong. This man, he didn't just have 3 mouths. He had 3 faces, or near enough to it. Spread across a lumpy palette of flesh were 4 eyes, 3 noses, and 3 sets of crooked lips, all almost perfectly articulated except at their edges, which ran together and apart like melted wax. I felt a combination of sympathy and horror looking at him. How had he have survived like that? And how could he have made it so far out here on his own? Stepping out of the car, I called out to him. Sir, I'm here to help you. I'm investigator Jesse East with the sheriff's office. Okay, I need to get you back to the hospital. The man had seemed oblivious to me before, but now he was staring right at me. All 3 of his mouths, discordantly working in unison. At first, I heard nothing, but then I realized I was hearing him speak, though I wasn't sure where the sound was coming from. I need your help. I nodded, trying not to let my growing fear and discomfort show. I didn't understand what was going on, but I still needed to do my job and get him back to the hospital. That's what I'm here for. Can you make it to the car? No, I need you to hear me sing. Your flesh will become the door. He wasn't really talking. It was in my head. No, I was being stupid. Freaked out because, well, reason enough to be freaked out, but no time for it. Sir, I don't understand what you... My words faded away as a sound rose from the figure before me. Not 1 sound, but 3. 3 voices, all singing different parts of a song in harmony. I doubled over as my vision began to swim. My chest and stomach felt like they were on fire. What was this? That song. I didn't understand the words, but it was still so beautiful, so wonderful and terrible at the same time. What was it? It is one of the names of my God. The voice thundered across my brain, never interrupting the singing of the 3 mouths in front of me. It calls to him across the dark even as it calls you to serve his purpose. I was on my knees now, barely able to think. This was all happening. The song, the spreading agony across my body, the feeling of pressure building to the point that I felt ready to explode. This thing in front of me was trying to bring something here. Oh yes, you will see. You will serve him. Even after death, you will serve him. The man's body shook with what might have been laughter, making the hospital gown flutter in a passing night breeze. I had to try and... No, I had to not think. It was in my head already. I had to not think, just act. But it hurt so much. And now he was ripping off the bandages, and I could see the symbols clearly in the headlights, bleeding tar like a dozen small fountains as he sang and sang into the black sky, and I can feel him. He is nearly here. Oh God. I had to do something, but it hurt so much and I couldn't let him see. I just let go. You will be the beginning of a new The thing's head snapped back as the first bullet struck it. I didn't think or hesitate, but just kept firing into its head until the singing began to trail off and then stopped altogether. It toppled over, and I quickly crawled closer and emptied my remaining rounds into its chest. It took me 2 hours to get rid of the body. I drug it out into the woods, past a nearby cow pasture, and dug a deep hole before dousing it well with fuel from my gas can. Only after the body had gone out did I cover it with several feet of earth and leaves. Maybe later I would have to find a better spot, but for now, this would have to do. I got back to the office as the sun was coming up, and Marin was there, waiting with a worried expression. "Where have you been?" "I've been calling." Shrugging, I walked past him without meeting his eyes. "Sorry, I was out looking for the victim. No luck." When he touched my arm, I glanced up and saw him frowning at me. "You smell like gas and gunpowder, and you've got dirt under your nails. You okay?" Swallowing, I nodded. "Yeah, I'm just real tired, you know." Marin studied me for a minute before nodding. "Me too. Maybe we should just stop looking for this John Doe. Yeah, what do you think?" I gave him a smile I didn't feel. "Yeah, I think that'd be for the best."
Story 2.
I was running as fast as I could, but I knew it was gaining on me. I swear it was trying to step in every puddle, so I knew it was running faster. I turned my head where I could see it. Its arms were limp as they swung back and forth in front of its torso. Its disjointed jaw bounced up and down, making an uneasy chattering sound, and its plastic-like face was splattered mud. How could I have ever let this happen? It all started when my dad came home from work an hour late. Being the realist that I was, I figured he stopped for groceries or something. I guess I was half right when he came in carrying a box about a human child size. "You mind helping me with this, James?" he asked. As I went to help him carry the box, I got a much closer look at it. It looked like an antique. The box was made of a very smooth, decorative wood, and the edges of the opening were made of a reddish metal. After we placed the box on the coffee table in the living room, I asked Dad, "What's in the box?" "It's a surprise for your birthday tomorrow," he replied. "How much did this cost?" "That doesn't matter. You shouldn't worry about that." Expensive. Ever since my mom died, Dad would always buy me far too expensive presents, mostly on stuff I don't need. I would really want a new mattress for my room. Mine feels like a pile of rocks, and I find it really hard to sleep at night because of this. I was still thankful for whatever was in the box, of course, but I have to admit that the thing I was looking forward to most tomorrow was my friends coming over to hang out. That night when I was lying in bed trying to sleep, I heard a slight tapping coming from somewhere outside of my room. It stopped as quickly as it started, so I overlooked it. I continue lying in bed trying to sleep. I continue lying in bed trying to sleep. I continue lying in bed trying to sleep. Giving up, I turned on my phone to see that I had been trying to sleep for a little over an hour. In about 45 minutes, it would be my birthday. I began to hear the tapping again. It wasn't loud enough to wake anyone up, but it was certainly annoying. Unlike the first time I heard it, this time it didn't stop. A continuous tap that felt like it was digging into my brain. Eventually, enough was enough, and I crawled out of bed and left my bedroom. I followed the tapping around the house, soon being led to the box sitting on the coffee table in the living room. I sat on the couch, and the tapping continued. Not being able to hold back, I began to open the box. I woke up from Dad nudging my head with his foot. I sat up and looked around to see that I had slept on the floor outside the living room. "What are you doing down there?" Dad asked. "I don't know, I couldn't finish my sentence as I saw the box lying on the coffee table. That's when I remembered opening the box and seeing two deep, reflective gray eyes on a beastly-looking doll that slightly resembled a dog. "What's in the box?" "That's why you were sleeping on the floor?" Dad asked me. "Go on and look inside. It is your birthday now." I stood up and slowly walked toward the box. I opened it to see, not a dog, but a ventriloquist dummy. The only resemblance to the doll I had seen last night was the eyes. The dummy had pale skin, a big nose, and bright red hair made of the same material that the rest of the dummy's head was. The bottom jaw was oddly missing from the head, but I did find it under the dummy's body, which was wearing an all-black suit. The bottom jaw had teeth carved into it, which I found weird since the top jaw didn't have any teeth, and the string that I would pull to open and close its mouth was the same string that holds the bottom jaw to the rest of the head. I slipped the string through a hole under the top jaw where I could grab it behind the back of its neck. I tied the string on the end so the bottom jaw doesn't fall off. The way the jaw hung there made it look much longer than it was. "Do you like it?" Dad asked. "Of course," I replied. "I saw it in a store window on my way home from work yesterday, and thought of you and how you used to love ventriloquism," Dad said. "I did always love ventriloquism. I had a ventriloquist act in my school talent show. While I was a talented ventriloquist, I wasn't a very good comedian. I didn't get any laughs. I would have been better off if the audience had booed me off stage." I put on a smile and sat the dummy on my lap. Through the dummy, I said, "Hello, James's dad. I'm Mr. Longjaw. You don't mind if I stay here a while, do you?" Dad laughed as he said, "You can stay as long as you like, Mr. Longjaw." The doorbell rang and I jumped up, setting Mr. Longjaw back in the box as I ran to the front door. When I answered it, hoping to see my friends, I was struck with disappointment as I saw my Uncle Zeke instead. I made sure that disappointment wasn't visible when he saw me, however. "Hey there, birthday boy," Uncle Zeke said. "How old are you today?" "I'm gonna need an answer. I really don't know." "I'm 13, I said. "What? You're not that old yet." Uncle Zeke had bright blonde hair and even brighter blue eyes. Being my mom's brother, he was the closest I've ever seen of her, genetically speaking. Uncle Zeke went over to the living room as the doorbell rang again. I opened the door to see my two closest friends, Rebecca and Tyler. Rebecca was a kind soul, but she was an absolute freak for the supernatural. Tyler, while also kind, freaked out with any mention of anything unnatural. "Happy 13th, dude," Tyler said. "That makes Rebecca younger than both of us." Rebecca punched Tyler in the arm. "James is only a week older than me." I let Tyler and Rebecca in, and when we got to the living room, I saw Uncle Zeke holding Mr. Longjaw, jokingly pulling up and down on the string, chattering its teeth. Uncle Zeke noticed me and laid Mr. Longjaw on his lap before saying, "Hey, James, would you like to introduce me to Mr. Longjaw?" "Longjaw," I corrected. Uncle Zeke picked up Longjaw and carried it over to me. As soon as I touched it, the bottom jaw fell off and bounced off the floor. Damn it! I picked up the bottom jaw and realized that the knot I had tied on the string was too thick for it to go through the hole. There was no possibility that it could have fallen off, and I needed to untie it to put it back on. When I got up, I made Mr. Longjaw say, "Sorry, the sight of James made my jaw drop." "Wow, dude, you're really good at that," Tyler said. "You should really look into being a professional ventriloquist," Rebecca said. "How do you do that?" Uncle Zeke asked. After a couple of hours of goofing off with everyone, Dad left the room to answer his phone. When he came back, he said, "James, that was the hospital calling. They need me in the ER today. I'm sorry, but I have to go. Keep Uncle Zeke out of the fridge." "All right, Dad. See you tonight," I responded. "The thing is, you might not. They need me to work late tonight." "Okay. Guess I'll see you tomorrow then." Happy birthday, buddy. After Dad left, we continued to goof off until it got late. After Rebecca and Tyler left, I put on a ventriloquist show for Uncle Zeke. "You amaze me, James," he said. "I don't know how you managed to throw your voice like that." "I don't either," I said. "It just kind of came naturally to me." "Well, I better get going. I'll be sure to tell your dad you did a good job keeping me out of the fridge." I went to the bathroom as Uncle Zeke left. When I came back to the living room, Mr. Longjaw was gone. I figured that I had just misplaced it, so I just went to bed. I didn't stay in bed for long, though, as I heard a loud bang coming from the living room. When I went in there to check it out, I saw the box that Longjaw had come in on the opposite side of the room. This shocked me. There was no possible way for it to get there. I was too tired to worry, so I picked up the box and locked it in my closet. Once again, I wasn't quite able to sleep on my current mattress, and eventually I began to hear the tapping. I was expecting it to sound like it was coming from my closet, but I quickly realized that it sounded as though someone was knocking on the front door. I got out of bed and walked over to the front door. The knocking stopped as I got over there. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. I turned around to go back to bed when I heard the knocking again. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife for protection, but just the thought of ever needing to use it made me uneasy. Once again, the knocking stopped as I approached the door. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing again. I slowly opened the door to see no one around. I grabbed my house key from right inside the door before closing and locking the door as I went outside. I didn't want anyone getting in while I was looking around. I started looking around the house when I noticed something in the bushes. It looked like a hand. It was a hand, Mr. Longjaw's hand. Somehow Longjaw got outside and was thrown in the bushes. I figured this was just a prank that Tyler, Jessica, or Uncle Zeke was playing on me, so I said, "Ha, ha, very funny," before grabbing Mr. Longjaw and unlocking the door. The door wouldn't open, the top lock was locked as well, but you can't lock the top lock from the outside. I gripped tighter on the knife as I unlocked the top lock and went inside. If this was a prank, it couldn't have been any of the earlier suspects because none of them had keys to the house. That's when I thought Dad. He didn't need to go to work. It was all a part of his elaborate scheme, a prank beyond all pranks. So I yelled, "Dad, this isn't funny anymore. Give it up." No response. I began to hear my phone ringing, so I put Longjaw down on the couch as I went to my room and checked who it was. It's Dad. Of course it is. He hears me yelling and calls me to avoid suspicion. I answer by saying, "Dad, stop. This isn't funny." With which he responds, "What are you talking about? Listen, we need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. He was talking pretty loudly into the phone, but I didn't hear his voice around the house. "About what?" I asked. "Uncle Zeke," Dad replied. "Did you see anyone around when he left?" "No. I went to the bathroom as he left. What happened?" "Someone was in the back seat of his car and stabbed him in the back of his neck, causing him to crash. He arrived here a few minutes ago. We don't know if he's going to make it." I dropped my knife before dropping to my knees. I looked around my room to see that my closet door was slightly open. I grabbed my knife again and stood up, walking toward my closet door. I opened my closet the rest of the way. Nothing was in there that was the problem. I ran to the living room to see Mr. Longjaw sitting upright in its box with its bottom jaw lying on his lap. "What are you?" I asked. All realist thoughts fled from my head as Longjaw lay down on its back and the box closed around it. That's when I told myself, enough of this shit, as I walked over to the box, knife in hand, and opened it. The dog creature I had seen before jumped out at me, pushing me onto the couch. I tried grabbing it, but it wasn't showing any signs of stopping, so I sliced at it with my knife, causing it to let out a loud whimper and fall back onto the coffee table. That's when I looked into its reflective gray eyes. I woke up by my dad shaking me on the couch. James, are you okay?" Dad screamed. "What happened?" I asked. "That's what I should ask you," Dad replied. "I came in here and you were passed out on the couch with cuts all over your face. Mr. Longjaw, the dummy, it's alive," I said. "It did this to me. James, I'm going to need you to tell me the truth," Dad said. Why was I stupid enough to expect him to believe that? I had to tell him a lie instead. "We went outside yesterday and I fell into some bushes. That's why my face is cut up and my mattress is uncomfortable, so I chose to sleep on the couch." "Why didn't you tell me your mattress was uncomfortable? I would have gotten you a new one," Dad said. "Here, I'll get you one tomorrow." "Why not today?" "Because it's 11 o'clock at night today. You didn't think it was morning, did you? Well, you're going to have to spend one more night on that mattress. I need the couch so I can watch my shows." "All right," I said as I stood up. That's when I remembered something. The knife that I was holding had disappeared. However, it wasn't long before I found it since the blade was sticking out of my bed right where I would be sleeping. Like my mattress could get any less comfortable. That night I had a dream. You'd expect it to be a nightmare. But instead, I dreamt up a plan to get rid of Longjaw, pretty much chaining up the box while it was still inside and lighting the box on fire. The problem was, Dad wouldn't appreciate it if I lit my birthday present on fire, and it's not like I could tell him that I didn't like it so he'd take it back. I clearly enjoyed playing with it. That's not the problem, though. The problem is that Longjaw is threatening me, and I'm pretty sure it was the one who attacked Uncle Zeke, who I regrettably discovered had died from his injuries. That morning, I called Rebecca and Tyler and told them everything. Tyler responded, "We have to kill that thing. Damn, this kind of thing isn't supposed to happen in real life." While Rebecca responded, "Cool, it's about time I get to slay a demon." I told them to come over as I put Longjaw's bottom jaw back on. I then walked over to Dad's room to see if I could get him in the mix, but was instead met with a note that read, "James, I'm out getting a new mattress for your room. Love, Dad." I guess Dad's never going to find out what happened today. When Rebecca and Tyler arrived, I picked up Longjaw and showed it to them. "He looks like a dummy," Tyler said, "and I'm not talking about the doll." "Hang on, Tyler," Rebecca protested. "Maybe it's just hiding its true self." "Forget this," Tyler said. "I should have realized that a living ventriloquist dummy was stupid. I'm going to the ice cream place down the street. If either of you wants to join me, you're welcome." Tyler leaves, and Rebecca gives me a pitiful expression. "Oh, go on, I know you like him," I said. "Thank you, James," Rebecca said just before she left. "Tyler was right. You are stupid," I said before throwing Longjaw across the room. I sat down on the couch and began to cry. I then turned my head to see Longjaw sitting up, staring at me. That's when I thought of something. "You're just a stupid piece of shit," I said. Longjaw then stood up. The only part of it still limp was its bottom jaw hanging by the string. I smiled as I opened the front door. "You're just a shitty little bitch and you should piss off." I darted out the front door and past Dad's car as it began to chase me. I stupidly ran into the woods. The puddles splashing behind me made me realize it was running faster than I could. I looked behind me to see that its arms were limp again, swinging back and forth, and the mud from the puddles had splattered all over its face. I then took out my phone and video called Rebecca and Tyler. When they answered, I showed them Longjaw behind me. "Shit! Don't stop running, dude!" Tyler yelled. "I'm gonna stop running!" I yelled back. I put my phone in my pocket before stopping. I grabbed a stick that seemed pretty thick. As soon as Longjaw caught up with me, I swung the stick at it, breaking off the bottom jaw, causing Longjaw to stop running. "Take this, Mr. Longjaw!" I yelled as I swung the stick once more, knocking its head off into the mud. Longjaw's body falls limp as I pull out my phone to show my friends on the video call. "You went for the head, that's so cool," Rebecca said. I then hung up the call and walked back home. When I got home, I saw that Dad's car was in the driveway. I went inside to look for him, and all I found was the same note on his door. Then I remembered. I saw Dad's car when I left. I opened the door slowly to see Dad's dead body hanging over the side of his bed. On his back was a note that read, "Don't you recognize your dad's handwriting?" Then I heard a faint tapping sound coming from behind me.
Story 3. His secretary had asked him if he'd had time for an interview today. Some small-time reporter looking to earn a few clicks out of a chat with an old businessman. He'd declined, of course. Told her to reschedule for next week, although even if he was alive by then, he'd still find a way to dodge the little bastard. 30 or so years back, he'd absolutely relished in this sort of thing. The attention, the acknowledgement of his success. It was what fueled him. Every dream he'd ever had ended in this. Recognition, praise, good job. Nowadays, it was just an annoyance, an irritating speed bump in his otherwise busy day, and any part of him that still wanted to illuminate the life of whatever little reporter begged for an interview from him was long dead. He was a busy man, with bigger fish to fry. As he drove through the heavy fog down the quiet dirt road, past old cottages and run-down stores. He couldn't help but scoff internally at just how twee this place was. Twee, that was really the only word he could think to use. He'd heard a business partner use it once, and the word had grown on him. Once upon a time, these encompassing forests and run-down marinas had been the greatest thing in the world to him. But now that he had seen even greater things, they held none of the luster they had when he was a boy. Well, perhaps not all of that luster. He did catch himself slowing down slightly as he passed the most familiar of the old bait and tackle stores that dotted the roads along the lakeside. The sign was old and faded, the colors long since worn away by time, but he could still faintly read the name of the store, Beck's Bait. Surprisingly, the place still looked to be open. How unusual. It had been about 50 years since last he'd stepped through the doors of Beck's, with his little brother Adam right on his heels. Adam had been a good kid. He could have gone far in life. They'd almost religiously pick themselves out a chocolate bar and a soda each, along with a tin of worms, before walking back to their parents' cottage along that dirt road. Usually, they'd head right back out onto the dock and enjoy the sun for a little while before getting to fishing. Usually, they didn't catch much more than minnows. But once, maybe twice a year, one of them would catch something that would have a place on the dinner table. The memory of it brought the ghost of a smile to his face before he moved on, leaving Beck's behind. The cottage wasn't far now, and time was short, and he knew better than to dawdle. Up ahead, through the fog, he spotted the faded sign that told him where to turn. The Dawsons' cottage. He and Adam had painted that sign themselves in their father's workshop. They'd both been grinning from ear to ear when they'd watched him nail it up. Time hadn't been kind to it. The text was only barely legible, and the fog didn't help. But the ghost of the words on the sign was more than enough to let him know that after all this time, he'd found his way home again. Exhaling heavily, he'd turned the car down the overgrown dirt road to the cottage where he'd spent the best years of his life. He kept a tight grip on the steering wheel before looking at the clock. He still had a few hours. He was sure of that much. His car was not made to handle the rough dirt road, and it rocked and jolted on the uneven terrain. If he'd had a little more foresight, he might have rented something more suited to coming out here. But now was not the time to think about what he could have done better. That time had passed long ago. The cottage loomed up ahead of him, secluded and cut off from the rest of the world. It had been a good 15 years or so since he'd been back, although despite that, the cottage did not by any means look bad. He'd at least had the foresight to pay someone to maintain it, and they'd done a decent enough job. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't collapsing in on itself. It would do for now. The cottage had ended up in his name after his father had died, and he had visited a handful of times since then. But eventually, his schedule grew too busy. His interests led him elsewhere, and he found himself with less use for the property. Of course, he could never ever bring himself to sell it. Heavens, no. That would be next to absolute madness. He could never sell this land, not for any price. It wasn't just sentimental value that made this place important. He'd learned long ago that there was no room for sentimentality in a man. But this place had a value to him that no check could match. Over the past 50 years, all of the good things that had come to him came from here. Every business partnership, Every wise investment, every decision that had brought him to the top had come from this place. His car rolled to a stop in front of the old cottage, and he got out, breathing in the deep fog and smelling the foul scent of decay on it. He huffed before trudging towards the front door and trying his keys. The door opened with a creak, and he stepped into the darkness that awaited him inside. With a bit of fumbling, he was able to find the light switch, and with a stern look on his face, he surveyed the old cottage. It had changed little since last he'd been here. It was clean and tidy, yes, but it was also clearly abandoned. Somehow, that brought him some comfort. He closed and locked the door behind him before reaching into his suit jacket and taking out the revolver he carried with him. Methodically, he checked over the gun to ensure that it looked good before he set it down on the counter. He'd never been one for firearms, but he'd made a point to learn in his youth. As a boy, he had thought it would be cool to own a gun, like the old-fashioned cowboys who'd been his heroes. Nowadays, he only ever carried it when it was practical, and he'd never actually fired it outside of a shooting range. But that was to be expected. He made his way over to the rear of the cottage and lifted the blinds to look out over the lake. Thick fog covered most of it and rolled up the hill leading down to the dock. But the dock itself was visible. It waited for him against the pale, glassy surface of the lake, the tip of it only barely visible. No boats were moored, and he could see none on the water. As far as he could tell, he was well enough alone. He studied the water, looking for any trace of movement, a ripple, a sign of life. But there was nothing. Satisfied, he turned away and reached into his pocket for his cigarettes. He'd started smoking when he was 13. Naturally, as soon as Adam caught him with a cigarette, he'd wanted to try one too. Adam really had idolized him. In hindsight, he probably should have been more touched than he was. But back then, his little brother's admiration had gotten on his nerves more often than not. When he'd started smoking, Adam had wanted to smoke. When he was mowing the lawn, Adam wanted to mow the lawn too. When he was with his friends, Adam wanted to be with his friends too. It had started to grate on him, but that was simply what brothers did and have done since the beginning of time. Looking back at all of it, he felt a little silly having been so frustrated by all of it. But no matter what he thought now, he wouldn't have changed a thing that happened. Not one little thing. When he was 14 and Adam was 9, a friend of his had told him about a book he'd found. Now, at a glance, the book was full of nothing but nonsense, occult mumbo-jumbo that was bound to scare some dumb boys. None of them actually took any of it seriously, but he'd let himself get drawn into the weird incantations and rituals depicted in the book, and Adam had done so as well. It had been Adam's suggestion that they actually try some of those rituals. He'd never actually believed it would work, but Adam had been persistent, and so to shut him up, he'd agreed to try just one spell. The spell they'd chosen was supposedly supposed to bring rain, and it involved a simple ceremony. One of them would draw a sigil, and the other would place a bell inside of it. Then, one would pour water upon that bell and strike it 3 times, then 3 times more. He and Adam had drawn the sigil exactly as outlined in the book and performed the ceremony as specified, and then they had waited. Once they had rung the bell for the last time, Adam had immediately run to the window in the hope that it would suddenly be pouring rain. But the sun still shone outside, much to his disappointment. He remembered that he'd said, "It's all right. Maybe it'll rain tomorrow," in the hope that it might cheer Adam up. Adam had just looked glumly at him and said, "Yeah, maybe tomorrow." They hadn't needed to wait that long, though. The rain had come on suddenly before mid-afternoon, and it came down hard. He couldn't remember seeing a downpour so bad before or since, and he couldn't forget the ear-to-ear grin that Adam had worn as he realized that their little spell had worked, and that they had just tapped into something that only a handful of people ever truly understood. A couple of days later, during school, he had snuck the book out of his friend's backpack. He'd played dumb when his friend later couldn't find it and made sure to hide it well inside his room. He didn't want to lose the power that they'd found, after all. The rituals continued after that. Always just small things. Summoning snow on the winter days when they didn't feel like going to school. That year had just so happened to have a record snowfall. Conjuring little illusions for their own entertainment. Like children with a loaded gun, they'd played with a power beyond their comprehension. Well, Adam's comprehension. Adam had no interest in the deeper secrets of the book, but he did. In that ancient text, he read about worlds beyond the one he knew, about impossible beasts with an insatiable hunger, and about rituals that could plot the course of a man's life in directions he could only have fantasized about, if, of course, one had the stomach to perform them. It seemed worth it, a little sacrifice in exchange for a life of success. Sure, he would miss Adam, but Adam wouldn't really be dead now, would he? They'd get plenty of chances to speak again, and when they did, his little brother would be so much more useful to him. He had performed the ritual one afternoon, while their parents had been out on the boat, and they had been alone in the cottage. They had walked down to Beck's, as they had so many times before, to get their chocolate, soda, and worms. Then they had walked back. Adam had been smiling, unaware of what was waiting for him. He'd drank his soda, eaten his chocolate, and run down to the dock so they could start fishing. Adam didn't see it when he took out the knife. He didn't have a chance to react until the blade was sinking into his flesh, carving the binding runes into him. And even then, all he could do was vainly struggle and scream before he was thrown off the edge of the dock. Adam had tried to resurface, of course, but he'd never make it to land. He'd placed his hands on Adam's shoulders and forced him back under. He'd held him beneath the water, looking into his brother's eyes until he knew that he'd gotten what he wanted. Life seemed to fade from them, but he could still see the ghost of something still there, a hint of lingering consciousness. The body was mostly dead, but the soul lived on in between the realm of life and death. Adam's eyes had remained fixed on his, and after taking a deep breath and steeling himself, he asked the first of many questions. "Where should I hide you?" It had been almost 50 years to the day since then. He had asked countless more questions since. Questions that Adam had answered. Questions about business, about investments, about love, and about the future. For almost 50 years, his oracle had remained bound, but its time was almost up. Many years ago, the book had warned him that this day would come. The runes would keep Adam bound, but not forever. There was a time limit. 50 years was all he could manage. 50 years with the body stashed beneath the dock, invisible to all but him. Adam had served him well. He had been a good little brother and a better oracle. even if he hadn't been exactly the most willing of servants. But the time had come to cut him loose. He took a drag on his dying cigarette and checked his watch. He had little over an hour left. Best not to leave this until the last minute. With a stoic expression, he took his gun off the counter and checked it again. 6 rounds in the chamber. He imagined he'd only need 1 to finish this. He took a deep breath as he headed for the door, his pistol in his hand. He descended down the hill towards the dock. The fog seemed to part in front of him, as if allowing him to pass. The air felt cold and cut through his suit, and the only sound he could hear was the faint but gentle crash of waves against the rocks. The dock creaked under his shoes as he set foot upon it and made his way to the very end. The water around him did not seem to move as he walked. The lake was impossibly still, and its surface reflected everything like a mirror. Yet he knew that as soon as he reached the end, he would see Adam's face clearly beneath the surface, and some primal part of him almost dreaded what he'd see. He reached the end of the dock and forced himself to look down. At first, all he saw was his own reflection. But soon, he could see his own features warping and contorting. The skin of his reflection turned the sickly green of algae, and the eyes seemed to bulge. He could see the ridges of bone around the sockets, and noticed that the nose and part of the cheek were gone. It was hard to tell where the tattered flesh of the cheek ended and the moss from the lake began. The sight of it made him cover his mouth in disgust. But the gentle yet knowing smile on Adam's face was enough to truly make him want to vomit. The reflection had changed from the rotten visage of his own face to the horrible remains of Adam. The Adam he remembered. Just a month shy of 10 years old, and having been left to rot for the past 50 years. Unable to die, but robbed of his life. In limbo, all for one man's success. Hello again, Rick. Adam's voice was as he remembered it, but the burbling, wet sound to it sent a chill through him. The tone was not the same as the one he remembered either. Adam had never spoken quite so formally, not until after he'd become an oracle, at least. What questions do you bring for me today? No questions this time, he said quietly. No more questions. Oh, have you finally come to set me free? After 50 years, here at the end, he could not bring himself to give an answer. I see. Waiting until the last moment, I see. Even when you've left me for so long. He didn't try to justify that. He just quietly raised the gun and aimed it down towards the visage of his brother. Adam stared up at him, waiting patiently. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked. I killed you 50 years ago, he said softly. It's time, Adam. And you've got nothing to say for yourself, even after all this time. That gave him pause. The gun trembled in his hand before he lowered it. He was silent for a moment, before he finally started to laugh. You're really asking me for an apology? He asked. You really think I'm going to look back on everything and regret it all now? No. I made my choices. I made them a long time ago. I may not have enjoyed all of it, but I made my choices. I lived my life. So you did, Adam said thoughtfully, as his brother raised the gun again. He looked up into the barrel before Rick pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the silent lake, and Rick stared down into the rippling water, feeling a weight ease off his shoulders. He'd done it. He'd dealt with his oracle. The circle was closed. He sighed and lowered the gun before turning around. Perhaps you've lived too much? Adam's voice continued, and he froze. Time is fickle, It gets away from us. Memories fade in old age. It's a natural part of aging. It gets harder and harder to keep track of time over 5 decades. You bound me here 50 years ago. As of 3 days ago. No. Rick turned around to see something moving at the end of the dock. A shape reached out of the water. The hand of a 9-year-old boy, pale as death, with sagging skin and algae growing off of it. Flesh had been nibbled away from the fingertips, revealing bone, but the hand still moved. Another hand reached up onto the wood of the dock, and Rick took aim at the sickening visage that emerged from the water. The arms, torso, and head resembled Adam, or at least what was left of Adam. But what came out after he'd lifted his torso onto the dock did not resemble his little brother at all. It trailed on behind him, a slimy mess of debris and scum from the depths of the lake, trailing weeds, driftwood, and the twitching, rotten fins from countless dead fish. Bits of broken garbage jutted out of his new body. Bicycles, tangled fishing wire and fishing lures, and the smell was overpowering. His heart starting to race, Rick fired the gun, taking off a chunk of Adam's head. But the thing that Adam had forged himself into was not slowed. Using its arms to move itself forward, it rushed for him, moving faster than he could have expected. He fired again, but the bullet was lost in the mess of debris that consisted of its body, and he did not get the opportunity to fire a fourth shot. Adam's pale hands grabbed at him, clawing at his throat as he threw his weight onto him, knocking Rick off his feet and pinning him onto the dock. It's okay. I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to let go, but I want us to go together. You and me. Let's go, Rick. Let's go. His pale hands gripped Rick's shoulders as he began to sink back into the water of the lake. Rick screamed. He thrashed and sobbed. He fought, but he could not break free. He desperately tried to grab the planks of the dock to keep himself away from the water, but his fingernails tore from his hands as he was dragged inch by inch to the end of the dock. Adam only smiled at him, letting him fight, letting him struggle. Rick looked at the cottage where he had spent the best days of his life and desperately reached for it, as if somehow, if he only tried long enough, he could grab hold of the door and pull himself to safety. But he'd sealed his own fate long ago. With a final scream, he was pulled beneath the surface of the lake and locked within Adam's embrace. The two of them vanished beneath the placid surface, and when the ripples stopped, it sat unbroken amongst the fog as silence set in again.